this might be it. Okay, so everyone, I just wanted to say good evening. Thank you for coming to our humble little webinar. There's a lot of other great events going on this week at the SMOL Festival and AWP. So it means a lot that you could come to ours, taking time out of your busy schedules. We're doing an event, this is using real life events in fiction and memoir. This is something I was really excited about. And I'm Ian Rogers, and I'm here with Gina Troisi. Gina, if you want to say hi.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Gina. And Anthony Diaris.
Hey, everybody.
Okay. And Elaina Battista-Parsons.
Hi, thanks for coming.
And between us, we all write some degree of fiction and memoir to varying degrees. And we've all had to grapple with this issue of using real life events in our work and how to do that. And the more we got to talking about this issue, the more we realized that we had a lot of ideas. And it was very natural for us to put this webinar together. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go around and we're going to give a quick introduction about our work and using real life events in it and the challenges therein. And then we're going to lapse into freer discussion among the four of us. I'm going to ask some questions and kind of go from there, get some discussion going. And then we're going to do a Q&A at the end. And if anybody has questions or comments, the chat is open. And so, feel free to, if something strikes you, make a comment. If you have a question, I recommend typing it out right away so you don't forget it. And then also, and then we'll get to it at the end during the Q&A portion. So again, the chat is open, feel free. And yeah, let's get started. And as Elena said, yes, don't be shy, don't be shy. Okay, so again, my name's Ian Rogers, and my first novel, MFA thesis novel, is coming out next month. And when you're a new writer with a book coming out, and you tell people about it, people naturally want to ask you about your book, which is good because then you got a lot of practice making your pitch and explaining the summary of it, which is a really good advantage of signing a book contract, might I add. So I've made my pitch many times. And so the pitch from my novel goes something like this. So MFA thesis novel is a comedy. It's about academia and grad school. And the main character wants to be a writer. So he joins an MFA program in the Midwest. And he's trying to write the great American novel. The people in his workshop don't like his novel very much. And the professor doesn't like it. And they're giving him all this comically terrible advice on how to fix it and what he should do. And he's facing all this pressure. It's a novel about finding your voice as a writer, as an artist, and figuring out what you want to do. So that's my pitch. And in giving this pitch many times, I noticed that 95% of the time, people would respond with some variation of, oh, is the main character based on you? Or, oh, is this based on real life? Or, oh, did that really happen? Or like, ho, it's all fiction, I bet, something like that. And my response was, well, first off, yes, it was. But also, why did you go there? Of all the things we could have talked about with my book, why did you, want to ask if it was real? Why did your mind instantly go to this question? And why does this keep happening over and over again? And so I realized kind of two things. The first was that readers and the general public at large are very curious about this. They're very curious about what in the novels they read, even though it says fiction, what in those novels is real. And I think there's kind of the tendency, some readers like to play detective and go through and say, oh, that was real, that was fake, oh, that's 50% real, and kind of go through like that. And again, it's something that people are very, very curious about. And then the second thing I realized was that in the writer community, writers don't talk about that kind of thing, especially in the workshopping, the graduate school world. It would be very, very rude to ask another writer after reading their fiction, was that real or did that really happen? You just wouldn't see that. And it is very, very taboo. And this raises the question of, maybe we should be talking about this a little bit more as writers, trying to get a feel for this technique and sort of the hazards associated with it. And maybe it shouldn't be a taboo anymore. And a quick caveat. So I am talking mostly about, realistic fiction or literary fiction with a realistic bent. I don't think speculative fiction writers, fantasy, sci-fi face this as much. I think it's because their work has things like dragons and wizards and interstellar travel in it. that isn't necessarily related to real life. I do think there's plenty of room in speculative fiction for real life type things, especially character relationships, things like social problems, political problems, racial issues, which I think make it into speculative fiction all the time. But I think, again, people are most concerned about this with literary and realistic fiction. And so to bring this back to my book, so my novel is about writers and writing. And spoiler alert, the novel that the main character ends up writing, it uses elements of his grad school writing workshop in it. So he's taking the world around him and putting it into his book. And in doing this, I kind of wanted to raise the issue of, okay, how much is Ian, the writer, also doing this with the book you're reading right now, and kind of play with that sort of metafictional idea. And the novel has a lot of conversations about writing in it amongst the characters, but there's one that sums up this real life issue pretty well, and I'm going to read for you right now. "You can't read too much into that," Jackson said. "Most writing comes from some form of the writer's own experience, but most often what ends up on the page becomes a distorted funhouse mirror version of that experience. So that figuring out the inspiration for a story involves undistorting its events and guessing at the real image. It's that distortion that lets writers put that 'this is a work of fiction' disclaimer on the title page without lying. Because whenever you change the truth even a little, your story becomes an alternate reality separate from what really happened." And that distortion kind of funhouse mirror effect, that changing of what really happened, to me is just one of the most powerful things that art, that fiction, that literature can do. That changing process to create something that's bigger than the writer, bigger than the person that it happened to, something that's more universal and kind of stands alone. And when I say distort or change, sometimes that involves, changing the facts and the nitty-gritty of what happened. But just as often, I think it involves things like voice, tone, the way events are portrayed, for example, with time and so on. There's many, many different ways that we can take things that are real and turn them into something that's art, something that's very, very separate. And for me, again, that's one of the most powerful things that fiction and literature can do. So that's all from me. I want to move on to Gina, who also has a lot of interesting things to say on this subject. So take it away.
Thanks so much, Ian. It was fun to hear about your process. I love hearing about that. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming and spending some time with us here. And I'm so honored to be here with Ian and Anthony and Elena, all writers I admire, and talking about such an interesting and layered topic when it comes to prose writing. So again, my name is Gina Troisi, and I do write across the genres, mostly fiction and creative nonfiction. And I received my MFA in creative nonfiction from Stone Coast MFA program at the University of Southern Maine in 2009. Since then, I've been publishing essays and short stories in literary journals and anthologies. Since about 2009. And last year I published my first book, my debut memoir called The Angle of Flickering Light. So since I published my book last year, one question I've been asked time and time again is, why memoir? Did I choose this genre or did it choose me? So I think that's a really good, interesting question. And when it comes to The Angle of Flickering Light, I'd have to say the genre most definitely chose me. Like so many memoirists, I did not have a conscious desire to write about myself, or at least I had no intention of presenting the work as nonfiction. I think it was maybe a type of denial. So what I mean is, well, I've been writing about these experiences, from my childhood and my adolescence and my early adulthood that eventually made their way into the book. And while I've been perpetually trying to make sense of my own life experience, I started out hiding behind the guise of fiction. So I had essentially been writing autobiographical fiction way before I was even thinking about genre and before I had a clear understanding of the definition of memoir. So in fact, when I applied to Stone Coast back in 2006, I actually applied as a fiction writer, but I submitted a writing sample that I considered to be a short story. But the thing is, I'd given myself a fictitious name, but other than that, the piece was entirely nonfiction, written in first person point of view. So when the certain mentor who called to tell me I'd been accepted into the program called, he said, "We think you should focus on creative nonfiction rather than fiction." And I was just ecstatic to be accepted into the program. So I simply agreed without giving it much thought. But in retrospect, the writing sample I submitted was actually the seed for my memoir. So during those 2 years at Stone Coast, I continued to compose the stories I was compelled to tell, and the book began to take shape. I had written openly about my father's infidelity, his and my stepmother's verbal and emotional abuse, and about falling in love with a man who was addicted to heroin and making a home with him when I was in my 20s. I had written openly about my own struggles with drugs and alcohol, my disordered eating, my weekend drives to visit a close friend who was in jail for drug charges. And like so many memoir writers who have come before me, a part of me thought, what have I done? I not only worried about revealing intimate moments from my own life and that I might be judged harshly for making some poor choices, but I worried even more so about what others' reactions might be to parts of their stories being included, about what my estranged father or my former stepmother or my ex-boyfriend would say or feel if they read the book and saw themselves within its pages. But writing memoir was a process of becoming self-aware, of getting to a place where I was able to understand myself and my actions and my decisions and my patterns and the ways in which I've been shaped since I was a child. And since we don't walk through life alone, others are inevitably going to be a part of our stories when we're writing memoir. So while I lost many hours of sleep worrying about what others might think once my memoir was in print, I also knew that it was impossible to capture the emotional truth of my own experience without including these details about other people. And I couldn't let fear stand in the way of telling my own story. So I thought long and hard about how I portrayed others, and I just approached the work as ethically as possible. I included an author's note in the beginning of the book stating that I did my best to recreate conversations and settings and events and to transform them into a work of art. I changed names, places, and identifying factors in order to protect the privacy of others, which I included in the author's note as well. And finally, because I was concerned about another person remembering an event differently than I did, I stressed that the story was written from my perspective alone. So that was also included in the author's note. So after years of writing memoir and searching for answers to pressing questions from my past and then making meaning on the page, I turned to fiction. And I found it incredibly liberating to no longer be confined to the restraints of memoir and to not have to adhere as closely as possible to what actually happened in real life. I was free to fabricate while writing fiction and to create characters from scratch. But of course, my ideas came from my own experience and observations. So while my fiction is inventive, seeds from my environment and details from moments that have made up my life definitely creep in. And I find myself exploring themes similar to those of my memoir, which is interesting. Addiction and perseverance and survival are some of the themes that keep coming up. So many of my characters in my fiction have experienced abandonment or grapple with a sense of home and belonging, just as they did in my memoir. And so once again, I'm writing about the human experience, but I'm free to combine facets of who I've been along with characteristics of friends and strangers. And when reading my fiction, people might definitely recognize certain settings or conversations or even names. But through writing and publishing both fiction and memoir, one thing I've learned is that it can be impossible to predict how anyone might respond to our stories. After all, in art, as in life, I think there is much that is beyond our control. So that's just a little bit about my experience. writing creative nonfiction and then switching over to fiction. And I'm going to pass it on to Elena now. Thanks so much for listening.
Hi, it's so great to be here. I'm really excited to be here. My name's Elaina Battista-Parsons. I'm from New Jersey. I grew up on the Jersey Shore. Presently, I write memoir and young adult fiction. My first published book is a memoir in shorts called Italian Bones in the Snow. She's pretty in pink. And that's with Vine Leaves Press. I have a young adult novel signed with Inked in Gray Press called Black Licorice, scheduled to come out later this year. I have several essays, poems, flash fiction published across different lit mags, other small presses. And I also am the creative nonfiction editor for a new magazine called Cordelia Magazine. So when I was writing fiction, which is how I started on my own, I kept ramming myself into a brick wall and I just kept piling up the rejections. I was writing a lot of really unique middle grade, but my voice was falling short. And I think I had 100 rejections over a couple of years. The hook wasn't there. So for fun, I switched gears to memoir-like writing during the Christmas time caverns of quarantine in 2020. And then all of a sudden, my brain and my fingers made contact, everything lined up, and I experienced a breakthrough with this memoir style writing. But it was really just nuggets from my life, a little poetry. I didn't think of it as a book. I didn't even think of it as memoir. I just started remembering things about growing up in my Italian-American household. I was the artsy black sheep of the family. I had too much to say. Shh, you're too loud. Shh, shh, shh. So, okay, I'm too loud, so I'm going to write it then. So it can't be too loud. My experience as the only girl in my family growing up, siblings, cousins, nobody around for me to really relate to. Except my mom and my aunts. I grew up in a very matriarchal kind of family, a lot of strong women. So this is where my work comes from. It comes from a very ancestral place for me, even my fiction. And I think with memoir writing, it can be very cosmic. If you don't know what I mean by that, you will when it happens. Suddenly, you're just called to write something. And when it happens, you have no choice. So how do you infuse your life into these projects? And as Gina said, it can be hard to really expose. So in Italian Bones in the Snow, it was very organic, this experience. It's not always that way. So I'd write in notebooks and I just wrote what I remembered best. It's the only way you can get started. Just write what you remember best in any order. Don't worry about the chronology. That's what good editors are for. One is here right now. Melanie, I had to shout you out, but that's what good editors are for. They help you organize. So just write what you remember. Write about the moments that felt the most interesting. I never asked these questions when I was doing it. I wish I had. What's the most interesting thing that happened? Instead, I just wrote, remember what I remembered best, and it started to click. I think readers know when you're not coming from a place that's authentic. I can tell when I read a book. So the more honest you are, the better, and worry about what people think later. And like Gina said, sometimes it happens late and you're like, oh my God, what did I just do? So my mom stopped talking to me for about a month after reading this. And I wouldn't say she wasn't not talking, but I could feel this coldness. Now she's fine. She's come to terms with this is something I had to do. But now I'm working on memoir number 2, and it's already twice the size of this, and I'm not even done. So I think our life stories like to come out in different ways. This one's much more full length. It's brutally honest. This one's a little more like Depeche Mode Bjork, and the new one is like Jerry Seinfeld, Tina Fey. What I can tell you about writing memoirs, don't soften your memories for the readers. Just tell your truth. Think about the universal concepts, but also be really specific. If you're writing about going to a bakery on a Saturday with your family, what was the name of the bakery? What was your mom wearing? And what was on the radio? I've learned that, no one cares, but they do. This is the stuff that draws us in. So it's funny, back to Seinfeld, we look at that show, it's fiction, right? His original comedy, but we learn so much about his humanity from his fiction that it all kind of just molds together. So whether you're going to infuse your real life in fiction or nonfiction, just do it in an authentic way and have fun with it. So now I'd like to pass the mic to Anthony Diaris and hear what he has to say. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Elena and Gina and Ian for organizing this and having me be a part of it. My name is Anthony Diaris, and I direct the low residency MFA program in creative and professional writing at Western Connecticut State University. And I see a lot of current students and alums here tonight. So shout out to Brianna and Matt and Kat and Francis for coming. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to read a few thoughts that I prepared about this topic, and some of it kind of overlaps with some of the things that Elena and Gina were discussing, but I kind of get into more of sort of the after effects or the sort of fallout from publishing a memoir, and how it's kind of this never-ending roller coaster ride after your book comes out. So when I first started writing, I wasn't thinking much about genre at all. I would often begin with a real event, something I experienced, and then depending on how that writing went, either stick closely to the truth or veer off into fiction. This was partly because as an undergraduate student, I didn't understand the rules or how or why to break them. So I would often submit a personal essay for a short story workshop or a short story for a personal essay workshop. This didn't always work out so well, and it was probably my first lesson in just because it happened doesn't mean it needs to be written. Later, after reading more memoir and embracing the genre, I realized I was more interested in my memories, why I remembered things the way I remembered them, and how they differed from the way my friends or family remembered them. So for years and years, I wrote and revised short memoir pieces and essays that would eventually become my first book, The Language of Men, a memoir in which my father, a Vietnam veteran, loomed large. I was fascinated with the language he used, the slang, the movie quotes, the song lyrics. But it wasn't until he had a stroke and almost lost his ability to speak that I felt a sense of urgency. I had never talked to him at length about his time in the war, and I didn't want to wait any longer. So over the course of a week, we sat down and recorded interview after interview, conversations that moved us through complicated issues like masculinity, violence, sexuality, and fatherhood. And later, after more writing and revising, I began to understand that my memoir, like all memoirs, was ultimately about the author. So I had to reckon with my own faults and my own stumbling through these same issues. At the time my memoir was published, I wasn't aware of the long-lasting impact the book would have on my relationship with my family. In a short piece I wrote for Marion Roach Smith's website, Writing Lessons, I described the conversation I had with my brother after he read the final manuscript. So this is the short piece here. I walked into the bar as my brother finishes his beer. One TV plays a rugby match. The other shows police officers in full riot gear barging into someone's home. My brother sets his pint glass next to the bound copy of my memoir manuscript that I gave him last week, the one which would soon be sent off to my publisher. Aside from the bartender, we're the only ones here. We hug and make small talk, and every now and then I glance at the manuscript. Some pages are dog-eared, and the binding has been creased in several places. It's scuffed and a bit dirty. It's been on the subway, I imagine, stuffed into his backpack or balanced on the back of his toilet. It has that used book swollenness to it, as if now that he's read it, the pages have grown too large for the binding. He points to the TV. Are there any rules in this sport? I laugh and shake my head. A player picks up the ball and runs the length of the field and scores a point or a goal. He celebrates alone with his teammates. He celebrates alone until his teammates catch up. On the other screen, the officers surround a man lying on his couch. The man looks up, and something about his eyes and his flip-flops make him seem innocent. Come on, my brother says, picking up the manuscript. Let's get a table. Our conversation in the bar was the first of many that weekend. We talked about what we remembered, how our perspectives differed. We talked about scenes in the book. We talked for longer than we had in a while, the way we used to when we drove around all night in the summer, stopping only for Taco Bell or cigarettes. As I wrote my book, I sometimes felt like the lone rugby player celebrating in the end zone. Sometimes I felt like I was barging in on my innocent family. But there came a point during the writing process where I had to consider myself and the people in my book characters. I had to impose some distance between the people in my life and the people on the page. And I had to realize that it wasn't my job as a memoirist to pause my life. Even though the book ends, life continues. In Memoir, we live the epilogue. Perhaps this is the hardest part of the process because the writer has little control over what readers, especially their family members, will focus on. My book continues to affect my life and the conversations I have with my family. In some ways, the book has brought us closer, and in other ways, it hasn't. Perhaps the conversation I had with my brother would have happened in some other way if the book didn't exist, but probably not. There is a ripple effect each time a memoir is published, and while the memoirist can't fully prepare for it, he or she should expect it. So for the past few years, I've embraced fiction. I kind of got sick of writing about myself and saw that in fiction, I could do sort of both, explore something that happened to me, but change it, combine it with other events, things I read, stories or conversations I overheard. I think I needed to first understand myself as a character before I created one from scratch. So starting with Memoir felt natural. With that foundation, I was able to move into and develop fictional events and characters. But the ironic part is that whether we write fiction or nonfiction, readers, especially those close to us, will often want to know what is true and what is invented, which characters are based on real people. For me, none of my fiction is completely invented. It is always rooted in some truth, some lived experience. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ian.
Nice. Thank you, Anthony. Yeah, thank you, Gina and Elena as well. That was all very well said. And part of the reason I was so excited to talk about this actually is because we all come at this from very different perspectives, which makes this very exciting. So yeah, Gina and Elena, if you want to unmute, we can sort of field it up to sort of discussion with the four of us. So I have a laundry list of questions here, but I want to start with kind of a meaty one. So I think we all alluded to this to some extent. We were talking, but when you first started writing, did you worry about the people you were writing about finding out or reacting in some way? And then how about now? Do you still worry about that? So reactions of other people to your writing.
I definitely did. There's a nice chunk of book that goes back to my college years and relationships. But then I really had to trust that I did it from a good-hearted place and the way I remembered it, because what else can you do? You know, they may have remembered it differently. And, you know, I trusted my editor. I trusted that I did it from a place that was good and not, yeah. So, you know, I did worry. Yes.
I did as well. I did worry, and I do worry a little bit still to some extent. I think the worrying was different degrees for me, depending on who it was I was worried about. So there were certain people, you know, that I thought, oh, well, you know, or if they read this, they be offended about how I portrayed them on the page, or that maybe I revealed something about their personal life or something like that. You know, I could kind of gauge that a little bit, but then there was another level of like, is someone going to sue me? And I think, so then, you know, my estranged father, who is in the book a lot, and my former stepmother, who, you know, I also haven't seen in many, many years, but they're no longer together. I was especially afraid of both of them, really. And I was afraid of legal repercussions. But in the end, it's sort of like everything else in life, right? Like, who are we living for? So I definitely echo what Elena said about it being from kind of a place of goodness, in the sense that, like, Actually reminds me of something from the book Writing Hard Stories by Melanie Faith, which is an anthology about, interviewing all these memoir writers. And she interviews Andre Dubus III about his memoir Townie. And he says something, he quotes like Richard Russo. But anyway, long story short, I think the quote from Richard Russo is that, are you writing this in relation to revenge in any way? And if the answer is no, then you're good. Like, are you writing this to hurt anyone else? If the answer is no, then you're good. So that was kind of a comforting line. So there's a lot of those kind of different quotes and bits of advice from people who have been through it. Because I think it's kind of a natural part of the process, depending on who you're writing about and depending on your relationships with these people,
Yeah, that was really well said, especially about the fear of getting sued, Gina. I think fear of getting sued for this type of thing is something that a lot of artists worry about, because it's something you hear about, on the news and things like that. And there's always that nightmare of like, okay, what if this person sues me? And I think that's a whole nother level of worry that can cause us to censor ourselves and to maybe not say something that we otherwise would have wanted to say. And so in some ways, it's a bigger and stronger version of kind of this natural impulse of like, man, I would love to write about this person or write about a character who did this. But then if the person found out, then I'd be in trouble. So maybe I shouldn't. I think dealing with that kind of reluctance and facing that kind of reluctance is a big step towards moving towards the sort of the genuine, the honesty that I think that writing can do so powerfully. And I think it's a matter of sort of keeping a lot of those fears and those worries in check. And then one more on the subject of being sued. I don't know if anybody's read Tara Westover's memoir, Educated, where she writes about just her horrendous childhood, growing up in just a rural area with a father who, made her work in the scrapyard, and she didn't go to school and she couldn't read and just so on. And she writes this tell-all memoir about her family and this terrible abusive behavior and gaslighting and so on. And it did tear the family apart. And now there's terrible lawsuits and there's a lot of money there. And so that's a thing that can happen. And I think that an artist or a writer who stands up and says the truth anyway in the wake of scary lawsuits, that's something to be admired. I think there's a lot to be said for that. And that really, really means a lot. Also, going back to what Elena was saying about coming from place of love, the one thing I thought was really cool about your book, Elena, in the actual author's note that begins the book, which I'm going to read right here. Elena's author's note: a majority of the names have been changed to protect people's identities. My recollections are as close to the truth as I can remember. I write from a place rooted in love. And I thought that was a really cool way to start the book.
Thank you.
That was just a really cool way to start the book. I mean, did you have any insight into how that author's note came to be?
I did ask my editor. I said, and it's even some of the things that you would never think. And I know my uncle hasn't read this yet because there is a part about him meeting Madonna. And he was so private about it when he told. And I am a huge Madonna fan, so I was not going to be private about this. And it's fun. But I just so it's those little things. It's more for some family members and my mom, there's a few things that maybe she might feel she's portrayed. And so I did have this like burning feeling, I need to say something. And then I asked my editor and she's like, just say something simple. Just keep it simple. I don't know if I even had to say it, but like Gina said, you lost some sleep. I didn't want to lose the sleep. So I had to say something. Yeah. Yeah.
Nice. That's very well said. And again, another shout out to Melanie Faith, who's here today. Melanie actually edited, a quick disclaimer, Melanie edited Elena's, Gina's, and my novels, actually. She's an editor for Vine Leaves. And she does a great job. Just a quick shout out. Okay, another question for everybody. This is more of a technical question. So a lot of memoir opening disclaimers or author's notes will talk about combining characters or merging characters for the sake of crafting the memoir or situations or events or something like that. Do you combine characters and events? And if so, how do you go about doing that for the goal of the finished work?
Yeah, I think I'll jump in there for that one. There were some scenes in my book when I was in high school, and there were like party scenes, and there were a lot of friends, and I had to kind of I remember originally writing those drafts and including everybody, and there was just kind of all these names being thrown around, and it was really when I began to understand, like, as soon as you name a character, it raises expectations for the reader. And then they're going to kind of like want to follow that person a little bit more. And then if you don't follow through, then they're kind of like, well, why did I meet that person? So I kind of went back and like, there were certain dominant characteristics or pieces of dialogue that I really wanted to include and that were important to what I was trying to say about myself. So I kind of merged those a little bit, but they were kind of like, it would never, like, I would never do something as significant as like, I'm just going to combine my brother and my dad, like they're just going to be the same person in my memoir now, like I wouldn't do it that. But if you have these sort of like ancillary characters that are kind of on the periphery and it's bogging down your work to like name everybody, then I think you can kind of omit or pick and choose a little bit there. At least, again, I think every memoirist is different. There are some memoirs that I think take that are much more comfortable with kind of, I don't know, playing sort of like fast and loose with what actually happened, but I think kind of going back to what Gina's saying, like, it's all about your intent, right? Like, are you trying to attack someone? Are you trying to hide someone? Are you trying to alter what really happened by combining these characters? Or are you doing it because it's ultimately telling the story about yourself that you're trying to tell?
Yeah. Well said.
That was very well said. Gina, Elena, any other thoughts about that?
No, but I saw a question in the chat. Did you see the question?
Oh yeah, I was gonna do. I was
Okay.
gonna leave the I'm gonna leave the audience chat so just for the end.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got a few more questions I want to go through. So Anthony at the very beginning said something really interesting about sort of memoir leading to fiction and memoir serving as a stepping stone for fiction, which Gina, you talked a little bit about as well. Do you think that's true? And if so, why is memoir a good stepping stone for fiction?
I mean, I think it definitely depends on the individual writer. For me, that was definitely true. And I think Anthony and I have talked about this, that this has been true for him, and not to speak for him, but I've talked about this with other writers. I mean, for me, I think the story I was telling really needed to be told, kind of how I was saying in my introduction. It wasn't really my intent to write about it, right? But I almost feel like I needed to clear some space to focus on other writing, because I think what ultimately became my memoir was stuff I'd been writing about, probably even in journals since I was a kid and then growing up. So it was almost like clearing that clutter or clearing my throat to be able to be like, okay, now I can invent some stuff, because that story that was like burning inside me that had to be told is now purged a little bit, So that's I mean, I don't know that for everybody it would be a good stepping stone, but for me it certainly was. And then with fiction, there's so many things that in nonfiction were tough, right? When I'd get feedback from other writers saying like, well, this character is so passive, or, this timeline's not working. It was really tricky because I was like, well, I can't just change the timeline, and I can't just change who the character was. And sometimes the character was me, right? So I'm like, can't just lie and say I was one way. So that's the stuff I've really loved in fiction, where I'm kind of like, I mean, there's obviously challenges to both genre, right? But I've liked that I can be like, oh, this timeline's not really working out. I can play around with it a little bit there and things like that. So in that sense, I think it's a great stepping stone.
So my young adult, that Black Licorice, that I wrote way before I wrote Italian Bones in the Snow, is just that the fiction novel, especially young adult, has been a big challenge for me. And it wasn't really ready when I got very lucky that I was signed this contract. It's gone through many revisions. But the character was too much me. And I had to really separate and work with my editor because the book was really about me mourning the loss of a friend who I write about in Italian Bones. But ultimately, I mourned his death through Black Licorice, through the character. So there was a lot that had to be done to make Freddie, that's her name, Freddie, not so much me, but still keep the parts. It's real. I found it very challenging. I find fiction to be an enigma. But that's why I love to do it. It's like that thing that's going to kill me, but I'll die doing it. This book's going to come out. So I can't help but infuse. And even the mother in the book is a little bit of me. And even the father is a little bit of me. I don't think we can help it. But my editor started to realize, you're not being distinct enough about each character because they're too much you. So you have to be careful. I found that challenging, but that was my experience. So if that made sense. Yeah.
So this is, we talked a little bit about, being judged by others earlier, but then Gina in her introduction mentioned the fear that of being judged on a personal level for maybe, things that she had done. So question for the group. So do you have this worry about being judged for sort of the you or the personal aspects of your memoirs or fiction? And how do you, if yes, how do you handle this worry?
I sometimes do worry about it still, but I find that how I deal with it, and I don't know if this is the healthy way or not, but how I deal with it is I completely compartmentalize. So, I bartend part-time, and a lot of my customers who I've known on and off for years will be like, oh, Gina, I read your book. And they're like, I know all these things about you now. It's like they didn't know me in this way at all. They've seen this whole other side of me. So sometimes I'm like, oh gosh, they read the book. But of course, I'm grateful that they read and supported the book. And I just completely kind of compartmentalize it and put it over here. And I'm kind of like, or if I know people read it, that may or may not mention it, I'm like, that's okay too, right? I'm not going to worry myself to death about it. But that's sort of how I deal with it. It's sort of, when we're writing memoir, we're writing about these different versions of ourselves over all these years sometimes, which are not ourselves any longer. So that's sort of how I compartmentalize it too. It's almost like they're referring to a different person in a way, It really does kind of feel that way, at least for me, because I worked on my memoir over a period of years. It took a long time to get published. So I felt a real sense of distance from the me I was writing about, even as I was writing,
I think that's so interesting, Gina. I remember working on my book and being so concerned about how other people would react to the things I was revealing about them. And then when I gave it to my parents, one of the things they were really concerned about were the things I was revealing about myself. And I was kind of like, oh, who cares about that? Like, that's me. Like, it just didn't bother me, and I didn't really think about the way that a parent might respond in kind of like a protective way of like, you sure you want that out there?
That's when I mentioned early on that my mom was very cold to me for a month. It wasn't anything I wrote about her. It was all, oh my God, you put that out there about, I'm like, yes, and I'm okay with it. Oh, but the protective nature kicked in, and it got in the way of her being able to be proud. It was interesting. I didn't expect that. Yeah. Yeah. I said, Mom, I'm good. Well, maybe I'm just old. I'm just old fashioned. I'm like, okay, maybe.
This issue is really interesting, I think, in that I know for me, with fiction specifically, having something personal exist in a fictional realm, I think for a lot of authors too, it does create a kind of safety buffer, and that you don't have to say, this is memoir, this is nonfiction. Look, it says fiction right on the cover, and there's a nice disclaimer on the title page that says it's a work of fiction, and like, whoa, that didn't happen, So you got that kind of plausible deniability aspect. But then, so there's that, and that feels like a safety net. But then on another level, I think there is still a tremendous amount of personal connection that goes into that, especially when you are having those kinds of conversations with people. And I think for me, especially when I was first starting to reveal more personal things in writing that I was publishing, was this sort of fear that the judgment would come. And then when it didn't come, or I didn't feel it as harshly as I maybe imagined it, I did start to get more confidence. And so I think as younger writers or any emerging writers who are just putting our work out in the world, I think that fear of judgment can feel a lot scarier than it actually ends up being. And then when we do share the personal or reveal these aspects of ourselves, I think it can create these very, very real, genuine connections that people feel. And that because people are always looking for genuine connections, I think that trumps or surpasses any judgment that they would feel, especially when the writing's done well. And it's very clear that, like Elena said, it comes from a place of love, not only for others, but for yourself as well. I have one more question from me, and then I want to move into the audience questions. And so we talked about judgment for others. Now I want to talk about kind of internal judgment or introspection. So my question is, with real life events, do you ever face a reluctance to dig deeper and face your own truth or your own demons as you're writing? And this is not judgment from others. This is just on a purely personal level. And if yes, how do you handle that reluctance to dig deeper?
So the project I'm currently working on, almost like the sister to this book, but the full length, no poetry. I'm finding myself doing that with this one, almost like I wasn't ready yet, and now I'm ready. And the way that I can dig deeper is by listening to other memoirs that are out there. I feel really inspired. What did I just listen to? Somebody's daughter. The author is escaping me right now. It was amazing. What's her name? I'll have to look at it. And now I'm listening to Dave Grohl's memoir, which is amazing. And he's really raw and honest about himself. And I'm like, okay. I mean, even though he's Dave Grohl and people will care more, I could do that. Like I could. So that's how I am able to dig deeper, is by being inspired by others. Yeah.
I would say, yeah, I've definitely been in situations where I knew I had to dig deeper. And usually I know because one of my writing buddies or critique partners, points out that I need to probe a little deeper in a certain spot. And then when I was doing my developmental editors with Melanie, there were a couple spots where she was like, okay, and she sort of gently encouraged me to dig deeper, and so that's more so how I've kind of handled it. But I like what you've said there, Elena, too. I think reading other memoirs has helped me a lot with all kinds of things I was worried about, just kind of seeing how brave and other writers have been and what they put out there. So yeah.
Yeah, I kind of fall in the middle there. I agree with both Gina and Elena. I think seeing what other memoirists have done. I think going to a lot of panels and hearing memoirists talk about their process and kind of seeing, I remember like being really like in the thick of writing my memoir and then listening to someone like Sue Williams Silverman talk about like being on the other side of it, right? Like she's written several memoirs and, you know, is very sort of raw and open about her experiences. And, you know, she just had such a like a kind of casual way of just like, you know, it's your experience, like, and, you know, own it and like you'll make it through. And it was just nice to see, like, knowing some of the things she's written about that maybe other people would shy away from writing about. And to be like, all right, she's all right. Like, she's not like, you know, blacklisted from the world in some way, you know, like you invent these things in your mind. Like, you know, I don't know. There were certain times where I'm just like, am I like never going to get hired for a job because I've written certain things? Like, and then honestly, during the pandemic has really, I went back, I said I've been writing fiction a lot lately, but I went back to writing nonfiction while things were kind of shut down. And I think part of it because it was like, why not? Like, what's the risk here? Like, you know, there's everything else seems kind of totally chaotic. Like, why not? You know, so there's something about this recent time that really kind of lifted any remaining element of risk for me. I don't know if others have felt that way, but yeah, that's how it felt for me.
I think that we always forget that vulnerability is something people respect, and you have to remind yourself that. I think that it's a good thing to be vulnerable in our writing. I think that we forget that sometimes.
That's very well said, Elena. I think, again, people crave vulnerability, they crave the genuine, but it does take work to learn to put the genuine on the page, both because, you know, the fear of putting it on the page, but then also just finding the words to express it properly. And I think about my own process a little bit. So I always say that writing about something is a good way to understand something, whether it's, you know, a very technical topic or just, you know, if you're writing a critical essay or something. And, you know, writing is better than talking or thinking about something because it forces you to get the words exactly right and get the ideas exactly right and, you know, puff them up. And so in that sense, writing about yourself or writing about personal things is just another type of writing about something that's outside yourself. And in writing about it and drafting about it and fine-tuning those ideas, I think it does, if you're really dedicated towards making the best product, it does force you to fine-tune those ideas and get something really, really powerful by the end. Okay, so we have about 6 minutes left. So I want to go up. There was a really good audience question I really want to get to, and that was from Susan, and maybe so Susan asks, I'd love to hear from each of you during Q&A the emotional journey your writing took you on and any healing that occurred as a result. So this is a really good one. Anybody feel free to jump in.
The first thing off the bat was I didn't know I had to write about it until I started writing about it, which was my experience with my bilateral mastectomy in 2019. I just thought, you know, because I had a really great experience. I was healed well, and I didn't. But then when it started getting on the page, I'm like, oh, maybe I had some healing to do about this experience. And so, yeah, some of the things that went on in the hospital and just emotionally and my recovery. So, yeah, definitely some healing that I didn't expect or plan, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Yeah, I think you know, I talked about earlier about that sort of like roller coaster ride of writing and publishing a memoir. And I think during the writing process is when I felt the most like kind of connected to it and that it was having the most impact on me. And then after I was revising it, I kind of felt like I was getting farther away from it. And then when it finally came out, it was this weird experience where everyone is reading it for the first time, but I felt so far removed from it that it wasn't really and sometimes like, you know, we'd have discussions and Q&As and I would kind of like reconnect with some of it, or I would be like, oh yeah, I kind of forgot about that part, you know, because it'd been so long. But I guess this is kind of sort of related to the question, but I became fascinated with that idea of like the reader has almost a closer relationship with your experience because they're seeing it for the first time after you have had so much distance from it, that I don't know, it created this like interesting dynamic of like, where is this story now? It's outside of me. It's now closer to the reader. So I don't know. I mean, I think Gina spoke at my my undergraduate creative nonfiction class the other night, and you said something about like kind of you know, when you're done with a book, it's no longer yours, right? It's sort of like it's out there and you don't have control over it anymore. And I think I struggled more with that than the actual writing process. Like I kind of struggled with like, now this thing is out there floating, and like some people seem to know more about it than me now because I have so much distance from it. So you know, I remember like I would get questions that reminded me of certain things that I had forgotten about.
Yeah, I love that. And I have to give credit to Susan Casey, who asked this question, but who's also a good friend, she's the one that gave me that wonderful insight about the book not being mine anymore when I sent it out into the world. And because of all the fear surrounding this process of writing memoir that can kind of come up. And, you know, I was so afraid. And she was like, you have to remember, it's not about you anymore. It's really about the reader. And it's so true, right? And then you publish, and, you know, all kinds of people kind of come out in the woodwork, like, and say, oh my gosh, you know, I went through this similar thing. And it can be something you never would have thought, you know, that they would connect with. And it can be someone you barely knew, you know, people that like I went to high school with, who I haven't even like seen in 30 years or 20, you know, 25 years. And maybe who I didn't even know that well. So kind of going back to Ian's point about people wanting that connection and that authenticity and kind of respecting that. So that was a really cool part of the journey. And then as far as the healing process, I think for me, the biggest thing was like, a lot of my book is about this inability to use my own voice. And here I am putting this book into the world that I felt it made me completely vulnerable, but it was also like this exercise in like using my voice, which, you know, I'm still always kind of working on as a person. But I would say that that was the biggest kind of healing thing that came from it. Yeah. Thanks, Susan.
So I really love this question. One of the really reasons I love this question is because, you know, we've been talking about, you know, real life events. And I think a lot of the events that writers choose to write about they do come from a place of pain or hurt or trouble or, you know, personal growth, trauma. You know, my own book is a comedy, but it's, you know, grounded in very serious events. And, you know, think about when I was in grad school and was suffering from low self-esteem and depression issues, you know, and then writing this book, you know, a few months later and sorting through some of those issues through humor, through absurdity and through jokes. It did provide a lot of perspective on, you know, things that were not so good about the experience and then versus things that were. And it helped me to personally, you know, sort some of those things, put them in order. Through art, through this process of the distortion and funhouse mirrors that I talked about at the very beginning. And then having that, going through that process and understanding it and gaining perspective that the art helped me to clarify. Again, I mentioned before, there's no better way to understand something than to write about and actually put the ideas in place. And it did help me sort through not only my personal feelings, but a lot of the conditions that do exist in very high stakes academic programs that I think are damaging for a lot of people. And again, my hope is that those will be a little bit more universal as well. I see a question from Marcia Bronstein that I want to ask. I won't read the whole thing, but is memoir ever written in the third person? I don't know if anybody else has a good answer for this. The most prominent example I know is Salman Rushdie's memoir, Joseph Anton, which is a very thick but very good book about Salman Rushdie being in hiding during the fatwa that was issued against him after he wrote the Satanic Verses. And, there was a death warrant on his head through all the 90s and some of the 2000s. So I heard Rushdie speak back in 2012-ish, and he talked about the creation of the book a little bit. And he said, it just felt more natural to use he instead of I. It just felt more natural to do it that way. And so I think there is precedent for that, especially if you have a reason or an artistic vision towards writing the book that way. I think there's plenty of leeway in writing that kind of story. So I don't know if anybody else has any examples as well, but I will write that in the chat right now.
No, there is a very memoir-like novel called Brass, and it's actually written, one of the point of views is second person. And I found that to be fascinating because, and then I asked my editor at my other press, why would this author choose second person for this character? And she said, she's a social worker and an editor. She said, a lot of times when we're dealing with major trauma, the second person seems to be the way people choose because it removes them. And so they're writing in second. That's the only time I've seen a sort of memoir handled that way. It's not technically a memoir, it is, but it's fiction. It's very close to one, but it's called Brass. And now the author's name is leaving my brain, but it's amazing. Yeah. So second person for trauma.
Safekeeping by Abigail Thomas is the one that comes to mind for me, which is lovely and very unconventional, and a lot of short vignettes. And they're not all written in third person, but some are. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great book, Gina. I think Philip Roth does something at the end of his book, The Facts, where he starts to kind of berate himself as his identity as an autobiographer, where he's kind of playing around with commenting on his own identity, so it kind of slips into a third person thing. But I can't think of any memoirs off the top of my head that have been, completely written in the third person, but I'm sure they're out there. There's so many different experimental forms that I think it's been really, really pushed.
Okay, I want to, and by the way, I heard one person say they have to go. If anybody does have to go, we did get some really good questions kind of at the end, so I want to work my way through those if everybody is okay. But this one's from Randall Nichols. Randall, thanks for coming. All of you talk about plumbing the depth of personal experiences and putting private aspects of yourself out there. How often have you, not from yourself or an editor, but from a third party or audience engaging with your work, had your own hangups, hobby horses, bad habits, or idiosyncrasies revealed to you by a third party? This is a big one. I feel like this was something that often happened to me as an emerging writer. Especially when I was in college and high school, even just starting to write. And I would write things that maybe weren't even necessarily personal, but revealed aspects of myself inadvertently that were not good and that I needed to be alerted to, and people who maybe harshly, maybe kindly, I think it depended, but pointed out, this suggests something that isn't so good. And I think sometimes that came as a surprise, or sometimes it was something that I kind of knew and needed to be alerted to. But I think that, again, especially as an emerging writer who's just finding his voice, having those things pointed out to me was tremendously helpful in the long run. In the short term, it hurt and was very embarrassing, but for my own personal growth, I think it was tremendous that kind of happened. And one, it taught me to be a better writer. And two, I think on some level, it taught me to be a better person as well. And if I hadn't attempted to write, not even necessarily about that thing, but about something bigger in which that thing was encapsulated, that interaction wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't have had those conversations, and I wouldn't have grown as a person. And so we all, sort of look down on or hide or are embarrassed about our younger writing. But I think it's important in that it helps us grow and it helps us learn these kinds of lessons. And that, I think, is tremendously valuable. Gina, were you going to say something, or?
Yeah, just to echo a little bit of what you've said, I think I've also had things like that pointed out to me. Probably the ones I can recall were more by mentors when I entered grad school, and probably at those beginning stages. And I really like what you said about how these things not only helped you become a better writer, but a better person. I feel like that's been true for me as well. That's all. Yeah.
Okay, this next one's from Frances. She says, "I'm not a memoir writer. I choose poetry deliberately to avoid some of the issues you were all mentioning," crying, laughing face. "But I wonder how you deal with writing from your perspective with ideas of compassion for others and perhaps intuition of what motivated them as they appear in your journey."
Well, I want to say something about the poetry, about sort of my book is a combination of prose ed poems, and the poems often end the essays. And I'm so lucky that Vine Leaves Press was open to this, because a lot of presses are not. So because it's a memoir in shorts, and I found myself doing that to hide a little bit and not to go too deep, and to sort of like frame it a little bit more, okay, that's as far as I'm going to go. Now I'm going to give you some, but I didn't do it deliberately. It just kind of came out that way. So I just wanted to comment on that aspect of it, the poetry. And I almost felt like I was doing it to respect the reader too. Like, okay, we're going to end this a little softer. Okay, next, next piece. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Am I allowed to speak?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was just, I did. Yeah, go ahead, Frances.
So I just wanted to clarify what I meant, and I think it might be connected with what Randall was trying to say. If we're not memoir writers, please take this the absolute right way. So when you're a memoir writer, it's your memoir, right? You're writing about how you see things, absolutely. So, but we all know that people's experiences of life are completely different. So, and again, I wasn't joking when I said the reason I write poetry is because I can hide my feelings about my mother by calling her the queen in the back of the car. But we know, and my siblings know, my mother would never get it. But so I just wonder, how do you deal with that? Because this idea that, like, of course this is from your perspective, it should be. That's why we're interested, and I absolutely get that. But like the idea of like, how do you work on the compassion for the people you're working about, specifically if they've caused you real difficulties in your life?
I feel like I kind of have two thoughts about that. Like, I think sometimes if you don't have that compassion for that person because of something that they've done, you don't need to manufacture it. It doesn't need to be forced. But if you find yourself wanting to, like, I guess this is where you can kind of like tap into some fiction where it's like, you wouldn't create a character that is, completely one-sided and, like flat. You would want to give them some sort of like, make them like a fully realized person that's complicated, and there's gray areas. And so, there's times where you might have empathy for them, and also anger and rage and a whole mix. So, I I think I kind of struggled a lot with that, with writing about my brother, because we've had some like tense, moments in our past. And I had to realize, like, when am I sort of like veering off into assumptions? When am I painting him, always in a negative light? Kind of back to Gina's thing of like, am I attacking somebody? Because I think readers will only sort of hang in there with you attacking somebody for so long, before it becomes like, well, this just sounds like, it's being written about too soon, maybe, I don't know. Do others have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I was absolutely going to say something very similar to what you said about the flat character. And I was thinking, it all just goes back to character and how we want our characters to be multidimensional. So I think there has to be moments of compassion in different places, and I think as writers, most of us have compassion, right? Because most of us are empaths and we're looking at things from all different points of views, even writing fiction as well. And I just think it's part of making a well-rounded character. So I definitely echo what Anthony said about that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think having a well-rounded character in a lot of times is key. And I think about, I guess for lack of a better word, villainy is very interesting to me. And then you can have a kind of two-dimensional Disney version of villainy, or you could have a more multi-dimensional, multifaceted version of villainy. And for me, kind of understanding why villains are the way they are, I feel like that's fascinated me since I was a kid, and I started to see versions of villainy that were kind of beyond the, the Disney versions. And understanding that, not to be confused with justifying the bad behavior, because I think that's a whole different problematic ballgame, but understanding, where does the bad behavior come from? Does it come from a place of greed or selfishness? Does it come from a place of fear? Does it come from a place of embarrassment? Does it come from a place of personal trauma? And I think those are all things to be explored with villains and antagonistic characters that will give that kind of well-roundedness that we're kind of talking about. I will end that with the caveat that I think not all villains can or should be explored that way. I think, certain types of behavior, I think you have to take a more solid stand against it by having it be more two-dimensional. I think certain kinds of behaviors are just better portrayed that way. But for most other kinds of antagonism that exists in the world, I think rounding it out can not only make it more interesting, but kind of prevent that kind of one-sidedness that Francis was alluding to, that that's just Ian's opinion that he's saying that and he can't be trusted, But if we get a better impression of who the writer's antagonist is, it helps stifle those accusations of one-sidedness.
Well, if I could, what you said, Francis, about your mom and your sister would know, I open my book with a story that does not, it's true, a true part of my life that doesn't make my mom look so great, but I balance it throughout, showing how she was good. So again, it's about balance and showing the fully realized person who my mom was, with all these traits, sometimes this. So yeah, I think it's about balance. That's what.
Okay, I'm not supposed to be part of this panel, but I can't shut up because that's me. But I'm sorry, I'll be really quick. And I can't, because I don't write memoir. It's something that really interests me, really interests me, but I don't write it. But I have these conversations with my sister about memories that I have, and she's adamant that my memories are distorted from what they were. Now, I have no problem with writing about my memories as they are. So I really wonder, how one could, from a writing perspective, and maybe it's an interesting experiment, and I don't know how one would do it. Again, I write poetry to keep it short. But like how you bring in those other perspectives somehow. It must be a really difficult journey, and I admire all of you for doing it.
Thanks, Francis. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's Gina, I feel like you mentioned something about this before, kind of the accusation or fear that maybe your memories weren't correct or wouldn't be interpreted correctly. So I don't know if you can speak to that aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, the first line of my author's note is this is a work of memory. So it's that idea that, you know, I have two sisters and there are scenes from when we were kids. And I mean, we absolutely remember things differently. And that happens in life all the time, right? Where you mention something to a family member or friend, they're like, oh, you weren't there for that, or I wasn't there for that, or I remember it this way, you know? So I think that absolutely happens. There's a really important scene in my book where I remember being with my mom when she finds my father at like his secretary's house, right? And it's not good. But she to this day says to me, no, Noella was with me, who's her really good friend. And I'm like, no, I remember it. So I wrote it that way and she was okay with that because like, this is my memory. I remember her being with her, like telling me to wait in the car kind of thing. So I think that everybody kind of who has a memory, right? All of us have memories and we all kind of acknowledge that memory is not foolproof. It's not infallible. And I think we just have to kind of accept that about one another and let each other kind of speak our truths. So.
All right, one last thing, and then I'm going to shut up, I promise. So I just had a memory the other week, and I put it on Facebook talking to some friends about particular kids' games, and I had a memory about a game that we played where you throw two balls up the wall and then you sing songs to that, you know, to that action. You're throwing balls against the wall. In my memory, I remembered this like long... It was horrific. It's like, you know, Josephine was dead and then, you know, she went to heaven with a crib or whatever. It's a horrific nursery rhyme, basically. And I put it on Facebook and my sister said, I don't remember that one. All my ones were all happy songs. And I actually like looked it up, and it is an old rhyme that kids used in working class London, but none of my family remember this, and they all think it's just because I'm a poet that I remember the bad shit. So I don't know. So just, yes, memories are different from different families.
I will say, I think there's always some, first of all, as Gina said, memory is fallible. And I think being aware of the fallibility of our memories is very important. I will say that, I mean, I've certainly misremembered things. Sometimes the things that I misremembered were more interesting than the things I may have remembered and can be interesting jumping off points on their own. And so I feel like we have been kind of beating around the bush about this, but sometimes memoir and fiction can blur in interesting ways. And if you have a quote unquote memory, maybe it doesn't matter if it's real or false. Maybe it's just something that you can put on the page. Maybe it doesn't need a name like fiction. Maybe it doesn't need a name like memoir, but it is something that can exist in the world to some degree. That is, just looking at the clock, that is probably a good time to end. I see a lot of people have been kind of waving goodbye. Francis, thank you for your question. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Elena, for going along.
Thank you, Ian.
With all of this.
This was great. I had no idea what I was joining. Again, I don't write memoir, but I just thought it would be really interesting, and it really was. Thank you all so much. And again, I really admire you for writing memoir.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, it was great. It was great having all of you. So
Thank
everyone,
you.
please take care. There's a lot of other great small fair events going on. You can check the schedule on the SMOL website. Hope you find some other good events as well. If you're interested in our books, the links are way up at the top of the chat. You can check those out. But yeah, have a good night and thanks again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Bye.
Night.
Night.
Bye.
Night.